In front of me here are 3 new COBRA drivers for 2022. Gone are last year's Rad Speed models, and in their place come the LTDx models. There's 3 of them to choose from. The standard LTDx, there's an LTDx LS, LS standing for low spin, and there's a max version as well that's been designed with a draw bias to be ultra forgiving. The question is, how do they perform? Well, I've tested these on a launch monitor up against last year's model. I've also hit them on the range, on the golf course, and I've tested one of these up against a previous generation Speed Zone driver that dates back to 2020. So let's find out how they get on. Okay, so I am going to talk you through my launch monitor data for when I tested the new LTDx drivers. But before I do that, I'm going to talk about what I think is the biggest difference with the new generation. And in order to do that, I'm going to hit a couple of shots with last year's Rad Speed driver. Now, for those of you who saw my Best Drivers 2021 video, you'll know I was a big fan of this. I think it looks absolutely stunning, both kind of in the bag, shelf appeal's great, down behind the ball. Performed really well in my testing, and it also comes in at a great price point. So I thought this was a really top driver, real top contender in 2021. So I'm going to hit a couple of shots with it. In particular, listen out for the sound through impact. Now, I felt last year when I was hitting shot after shot with all of the different drivers that were on the market, I felt as if this was on probably the higher end of the spectrum in terms of the impact sound, that the sort of pitch through impact. It's just it performs really well. I mean, probably can't see that through the camera, just a lovely ball flight, exactly where I'd want it to be. My only slight thing for me would be that sound through impact being quite high. And I appreciate there are some people out there that like that higher impact sound, the feeling that the ball's going to kind of get up and away without having to put too much effort into the shot. I'm going to hit one and then I'm going to switch straight into the standard LTDx, and hopefully you'll hear a difference. Hopefully you can pick up on that. It's much more muted this year. For me, it's more powerful as well. It's got that kind of just on the right side of being too dull. It's not too dull, it's lively, it feels powerful, but it's not too loud. I think this is a significant improvement for me on the way that the driver sounds. And I took it out with me onto the golf course, a tree-lined golf course, and it had such a satisfying crack through impact as the sort of sound echoed through the trees. So for me, the big difference, I think, between this generation and the previous generation, and I will come on to the launch monitor data, is the feel and the sound. And I think you'll probably notice from the looks, you know, they've carried on with the theme. I think that's because last year's driver looked absolutely superb. I don't think they were ever going to make drastic changes to the way in which it looks. This one, for me, is possibly more refined. They've gone for this sort of golden colour on the sole, on the crown, and they've got rid of the kind of electric green. So it's not as exciting, but it's possibly more refined. If I had to choose one of these drivers for the way in which it looks, I'd probably go with the Rad Speed. I think the Rad Speed looks absolutely fantastic. There's hardly anything in it, to be honest with you. Shape-wise, possibly the LTDx, a fraction bigger down behind the ball. But again, not much in it. Now, the other thing to say in terms of the looks is that the Max version has the same matte black crown that the other drivers in the range have. And that's different from last year. Last year, it had that kind of slightly glossy, shinier finish to it. This year, it's the same across the board. And actually down behind the ball, all 3 drivers look very similar. For me, this Max version sits nice and square down behind the ball. So for those players who are looking for a very forgiving driver that also has that draw bias built into it, but don't want something that kind of looks as if it's going a bit left, this Max version of the LTDx, for me, fits the bill really nicely on that front. And because it's quite a generous footprint down behind the ball, I don't think necessarily that it needs that shiny finish to make it feel a bit bigger down behind the ball. This still looks, to me, and feels quite inviting as I stand over it. And hopefully you can pick up on this, it has that same crack through impact that the other drivers in the range have. Yeah. It's a big change to the way in which this sounds. For me, it's an improvement. Okay, so as promised, I'm going to show you the launch monitor data that I was able to get when I tested these new drivers at King's Golf Studio using the TrackMan launch monitor Pro V1X golf balls, same shaft in all the drivers. They're all set up in the same way. So it's a nice like-for-like comparison. And I think that the top line summary is they perform really well. They are every bit a premium driver. The price tag might not be quite as high as other premium drivers in the market, but they perform really, really well. So plenty of distance and plenty of consistency across the board. But there were some differences in terms of the way the heads perform. So the Max version did, as you would hope, as you would expect, launch a bit higher, spin a bit more, hung in the air for a little bit longer. It had that draw bias. I noticed that during my testing, but it wasn't huge. But for me, it was the shortest of the three heads because of that extra bit of spin. The LTDx sits nicely in the middle in terms of its spin profile, and then the LS version definitely spun a bit less, more aggressive ball flight, didn't carry quite as far as the standard model, but it ran out a bit further. So in terms of the overall total distance between those two, it was pretty much the same. So lots in terms of performance to get excited about by this new COBRA range. The question is it any better than last year's Rad Speed model? Well, I tested the Rad Speed on the same day as well. Same shaft, same setup, and I actually had the heavyweight moved forward. So I had it in its low spin setting and up against the LTDx LS. Here is how the launch monitor data differs. And the LTDx LS did perform that little bit better. But it's important to say that despite not trying to, it seems that I was swinging the club a little bit harder. I was delivering more ball speed with the new version of this driver, and that delivered that bit more overall distance. The Rad Speed was spinning a bit less, so again, whilst it didn't carry quite so far, the overall total distances were very similar. And I think it's important to say here that in terms of performance, you can pick at the numbers and try and identify some slight differences in them, but really it was very similar from generation to generation. That leads me to my on-course testing, which I think is probably for me, the most valuable part of the testing that I do. And I took the standard version with me out onto the golf course, and I really liked the way that it performed. Just easy to flight on a cold sort of January morning out here in the UK where the temperature struggles to get above about 5 degrees. Really easy to hit, really easy to fly. Provided me with plenty of distance. I think that's one of the things that I really noticed. It was the consistency of distance. So over the course of the round, there was just 18 yards difference in terms of distance between my best shot and my worst shot. And I thought that was really impressive. And it was just that kind of mid-profile ball flight from the standard model, exactly the sort of thing that I would be looking for, that I was impressed by. I also felt like I was in enough control of it to be able to hit little fades and little draws. So overall, the LTDx version was really impressive. The standard version that I took with me out on the golf course, very good. And when you couple it with that lovely impact sound, the really premium kind of refined look that it has, I think you've got an overall package here that works really well. Okay, so the last thing I want to touch on is the performance of the Max version of the LTDx. Because whilst it wasn't the longest of the three for me, I did like the performance. I found it really consistent. And as I mentioned before, it sits nice and square down behind the ball, and it delivers that nice kind of reliable draw bias that so many golfers I think are going to be looking for. So what I did was I tested it up against the Speed Zone Extreme from 2020. You can see here quite a significant difference actually in terms of the way that they look down behind the ball. The Speed Zone Extreme has that glossier finish to it. It's slightly bigger in terms of its profile. For me, the Max is much more refined. It looks more modern. It looks a bit more premium actually than the Speed Zone. But actually in terms of the launch monitor data, as I'll flash them up on the screen now, there's not a massive amount of difference, it's fair to say. The numbers are fairly consistent across the board, but it's worth calling out that I was a bit longer with the LTDx Max. But for me, the big finding was just how much more consistent I was with this driver. I think that I felt like I was in complete control of this, that every time I hit it, it was going where I wanted it to, and it delivered that same ball flight, the same shape that I was looking for sort of time and time again. I was less consistent with the Speed Zone extreme. I think that sort of talks to some of the technological improvements that COBRA have managed to build in to the LTDx family of drivers. They are just, for me, delivering that little bit more consistency over what we've seen in the past from COBRA. So for those players who are, as I said earlier, in the market for a draw bias driver, but the one that doesn't sit too close behind the ball, I really do think you get an awful lot of performance from the LTDx Max. Right, so that brings me on to the final part of my review, which is to look at the price. So these come in with a recommended retail price in pounds here in the UK of $399. So slightly more expensive than what we've been used to over the last couple of years from COBRA, but not drastically. And they still sit in slightly below the other premium driver brands. And yet you still get premium looks, premium performance, and that kind of level of consistency that, in particular, amateur golfers are really looking for. So I do think you get an awful lot for your money with COBRA and with the LTDx range for 2022, which might not be drastically different to what we've seen from the brand in years gone by. But I think that the performance and the looks, the overall package that you get here, has just been nudged forward a little bit over what we've seen from COBRA in the past. If it was my choice, if I was choosing one of the three drivers to choose from, it would definitely be the standard LTDx. Just that really kind of perfect blend for me of spin, good flight, plenty of distance, feels ultra playable out on the golf course. So it'd be the X version that I'd go for. But having said that, I think all three heads do a good job, and with a good fitting, I think most golfers would be able to find a setup that really works well for them. Please do leave some comments below. Have you used COBRA drivers over the last couple of years? If so, what have you thought about them? And would you be tempted to move into the LTDx? If you've played other brands of drivers, again, would you be tempted by a COBRA offering? We'd be really interested to hear your thoughts. But that's it for now from the London Club. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.